In September of this year, Libya was hit with devastating floods that have killed tens of thousands and displaced millions. However, the news did not get as much attention as it needed, given that Libya sank into a public health crisis. Storm Daniel, which was one of the most powerful cyclones Libya had ever witnessed, brought heavy rainfalls, sinking cities, and surpassing dams' capacities. This exacerbated the situation and contributed to sinking cities that are surrounded by mountains. One of the cities, Derna, has been totally wiped out and vanished by floods. Now, after about 2 months of the floods, the people of Libya are finding out whose fault it was, and they have taken to the streets, burning ministers' houses. It appears that things are getting out of hand in Libya and can lead to something unexpected, as the government has already started punishing the protesters. Are we getting ready for another coup in Africa? Watch the video until the very end to find out. Let's know what has happened until now and where the situation is heading. On September 13th, the formidable cyclone known as Storm Daniel struck Libya, bringing unprecedented levels of rainfall. In certain regions, the rainfall surpassed historical records, exceeding expectations and overwhelming unprepared infrastructure. The sheer volume of water, concentrated within a short period, set the stage for a disastrous outcome. Storm Daniel, also referred to as Cyclone Daniel, stood as the deadliest Mediterranean tropical-like cyclone in recorded history, and the costliest tropical cyclone on record outside of the North Atlantic Ocean. Emerging as a low-pressure system around September 4, 2023, the storm affected Greece, Bulgaria, and Turkey, causing extensive flooding. It then organized as a Mediterranean low and was designated as Storm Daniel. Eventually, it acquired quasi-tropical characteristics and moved toward the Libyan coast, resulting in catastrophic flooding before degenerating into a remnant low. In Greece, severe rainfall led to flooding that caused over €2 billion in damage, making it the most costly recorded storm for the country. Libya experienced the most deadly impact, with rains causing 2 dams near the city of Derna to fail. This event led to over 4,000 deaths, and between 10,000 and 100,000 people were reported missing, though exact figures varied by source. The vulnerability of Libya to such disasters was linked to its civil war, which had damaged critical infrastructure and left it in poor condition before the storm. In the aftermath, several countries along the Mediterranean Sea pledged to aid the affected nations. Osama Hamada, the Prime Minister of the Government of National Stability in control of eastern Libya, declared a state of emergency on September 9th, suspending classes as a precautionary measure. The National Oil Corporation also implemented a 3-day closure of 4 oil ports: Ras Lanuf, Zueitina, Brega, and Sidra. Subsequently, Ras Lanuf, Brega, and Sidra resumed operations on September 12th, with Zueitina reopening on September 13th. In the aftermath, at least 4,233 lives were tragically lost, predominantly in and around the city of Derna, following the collapse of the Derna and Mansour dams. This unleashed an estimated 30 million cubic meters of water, causing catastrophic damage as the Wadi Derna overflowed its banks by 50 meters on each side, resulting in the displacement of 30,000 residents. Before the storm hit, residents were subjected to a precautionary curfew imposed at 10:01 p.m. on September 10th, restricting them from leaving their homes. Prime Minister Hamada observed that residential neighborhoods were swept away, with social media posts showcasing cars submerged in the flood. The collapse of 4 bridges and Hamada's aviation minister, describing Derna as resembling a tsunami, further highlighted the severity of the situation, with 25% of the city seemingly disappearing and large parts being dragged out to the Mediterranean Sea. Health Minister Othman Abdul Jalil reported 6,000 people missing in Derna alone. At the same time, the mayor of Derna, Abdul Menem Al-Gaithi, speculated that the final death toll in the city could range from 18,000 to 20,000, equivalent to a fifth of the city's population. Only 3 of the city's 10 districts escaped flooding, and 5 out of 7 entry routes into Derna were rendered inaccessible. The collapse of bridges along the Wadi Derna effectively split the city into 2. Out of the 6,142 buildings in Derna, 1,500 suffered damage, with 891 completely destroyed, 211 partially destroyed, and the remaining 398 submerged in mud. An estimated 6 square kilometers of land in the city were submerged. The city's hospitals became inoperable, morgues filled up, and bodies were laid out on sidewalks and in the city's main square. Over 300 bodies were sent to a morgue in Tobruk due to overcrowding, and more than 1,000 bodies were laid to rest in mass graves. Naval teams were deployed to recover bodies swept out to sea by the floods. In the following days, at least 200 bodies were discovered washed up as far as 20 kilometers from Derna, with some found more than 100 kilometers from the city. Dozens of victims were found trapped in their cars at sea. The scale of the disaster in Derna was attributed to decades of neglect of the region by Muammar Gaddafi's regime, coupled with the city becoming a battleground during the civil war and concurrent NATO intervention in the 2010s. Following Gaddafi's overthrow, the city changed hands 4 times. The collapsed dams, constructed by the Yugoslav company Hidrotehnika Hidroenergetika from 1973 to 1977 to control flooding, irrigate agricultural lands, and provide water to nearby communities, were described as clay-filled dams with heights of 75 meters and 45 meters respectively. Both dams sustained major damage in a storm in 1986, with reported cracks in 1998. Derna's deputy mayor revealed that the dams had not undergone maintenance since 2002 and were not designed to withstand such volumes of water. It remained neglected despite allocating over €2 million in 2012 and 2013 for maintenance. A Turkish construction firm, Arcel Construction Company Limited, claimed to have been contracted for maintenance work on the dam and to build another in 2007, asserting completion in 2012. Libyan officials refuted these claims, stating that the company halted work following the outbreak of the civil war in 2011. As recently as 2022, a researcher at Omar al-Mukhtar University in Baida, Libya, issued a warning in a paper that the dams urgently needed attention, highlighting a high potential for flood risk. The paper emphasized the urgent need for dam maintenance, foreseeing catastrophic consequences in a massive flood. You should know that the Wadi Derna experienced 4 major floods between 1942 and 2011. The collapse of the Derna Dam, located at the convergence of 2 river valleys, led to waters rushing 12 kilometers toward the sea, overwhelming the Mansour Dam, already under stress from rising water levels in its reservoir. Representatives of the Red Cross reported that the dam's failure produced waves with a height of 7 meters. In specific areas, the flood surged like a convoy of speeding cars, reaching speeds of over 120 kilometers an hour over the tops of 30-meter-high palm trees. Residents of Derna assert that the region is still grappling with trauma and a lack of humanitarian aid to replace what they lost, which, for many, was everything. Over 43,000 people remain displaced, with reports of increasing suicides and other mental health crises. While mental health is one of Derna's most urgent needs, according to Talal Bernaz, the Libya country director at International Medical Corps, addressing it is challenging. Libya lacks trained psychologists and a culture of mental health care. However, the trauma has resulted in rising suicide rates and insufficient psychosocial support. We started seeing lots of reports about cases who committed suicide or tried to commit suicide in that region, he says. And those people, of course, were mentally affected by the loss of their family members, and that number is not small. In areas washed away by the floods, recovery has been slow and sometimes haphazard, with aid suspended from time to time and critical recovery projects still in the planning phase, says Alawami from the Red Crescent. As winter approaches, many families still need basic items, like warm blankets and sheets. In the aftermath of the floods, people from all over Libya rushed to the devastated region, working with aid groups or providing assistance from their homes and neighborhoods, according to Mary Fitzgerald, a Libya expert from the Middle East Institute, a Washington-based think tank. Both of Libya's governments pledged their commitments to aid the region's recovery. However, in the subsequent weeks, many volunteers had to return to their families and jobs, and the joint efforts promised by the 2 governments did not materialize into a new era of collaboration. Derna and the surrounding region remain isolated due to political divisions, ravaged by years of war, easily overlooked by the global community, and susceptible to abuses and corruption. Immediately after the floods, locals protested, expressing anger over the corruption and mismanagement they believed led to the dam collapse. However, since then, international journalists and researchers have mostly been denied entry into the region. Since no one can report the protests' condition, the world knows little about what's happening inside Libya. Yet the people who lost their families and relatives didn't cry for them. There wasn't time to grieve. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. And now, protests are pushing Libya to a breaking point. Thousands of protesters in Derna, Libya, voiced their frustration with the authorities, alleging negligence in the aftermath of a devastating flash flood that claimed thousands of lives. The United Nations has cautioned about the potential for disease outbreaks, intensifying the already dire crisis. Demonstrators gathered outside the city's Grand Mosque, condemning the parliament in East Libya and its leader Aguila Saleh. Their slogans called for the parliament's downfall and accused Aguila Saleh, demanding a swift investigation into those responsible for the disaster. The protesters also urged the establishment of a United Nations office in Derna, city reconstruction, compensation for affected residents, and an inquiry into the city council and past budgets. An analyst highlighted the conflict between survivors and those they hold responsible for the death and destruction in Derna. The turmoil in Libya, since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, has resulted in the neglect of crucial infrastructure maintenance, as emphasized by politicians and analysts. Everything was going great as long as Muammar Gaddafi was in power. However, after he was dethroned and killed by NATO, Libya's breakdown started. Now, more protests are surfacing, pushing the responsible government into the corner. A multitude of protesters in the eastern Libyan city of Derna voiced their frustration with authorities and called for accountability, marking 1 week since a flood claimed the lives of thousands and wreaked havoc on entire neighborhoods. The demonstration, staged outside the Sahaba Mosque, specifically targeted officials, including Aguila Saleh, the head of the eastern-based Libyan parliament. Some demonstrators positioned themselves on the roof before the mosque's distinctive golden dome, a prominent landmark in Derna. Later in the evening, infuriated protesters set fire to the residence of Abdulmenam Al-Gaidi, who served as the mayor of Derna at the time of the flood. The mayor's residence, owned by Abdulmenam Al-Gaidi, has become a focal point of public anger. Residents expressed dissatisfaction with the lack of warnings from officials about the impending rainfall, believing that authorities were aware of the imminent danger. Although residents claim they received a stay-at-home warning instead of an evacuation order, officials deny this. Hisham Abu Chikiwat, a minister in the eastern Libyan government, declared that Gaiti had been suspended from his position. The parallel government in eastern Libya, headed by Prime Minister Usama Hamad, ousted all of Derna's municipal council members and referred them for investigation. This protest marked the initial significant demonstrations since the flood, triggered by the failure of 2 dams outside the city during a powerful storm. Protesters echoed slogans like, "Aguila, we don't want you. All Libyans are brothers," calling for national unity in a country scarred by more than a decade of conflict and chaos. Mansour, a participating student, urged an urgent investigation into the dam collapses, which resulted in the loss of thousands of lives. Taha Miftah, 39, stressed that the protest conveyed a message about the government's failure to manage the crisis, placing particular blame on the parliament. He called for an international inquiry into the disaster and advocated for reconstruction under international supervision. The full extent of the death toll remains unknown, with thousands of people still missing and officials providing varying death tolls. The World Health Organization confirmed 3,122 deaths. Saleh, attempting to deflect blame, characterized the flood as an unprecedented natural disaster, urging people not to dwell on what could or should have been done. Commentators have highlighted prior warnings, including an academic paper from last year outlining Derna's vulnerability to floods and the urgent need to maintain the protective dams. You should know that Derna is located in eastern Libya, under the control of military commander Khalifa Haftar, and overseen by a government parallel to the internationally recognized administration in Tripoli in the west. Amid internal power struggles since the ousting of Muammar Gaddafi, Libya currently grapples with two governments, one UN-recognized in Tripoli and another in the east supported by warlord Gen Khalifa Haftar. Haftar attributes the flooding to a natural disaster, but many Libyans argue that the eastern government neglected the dams despite prior warnings about their precarious condition. Scientists from the World Weather Attribution Group attribute the transformation of extreme weather into a humanitarian disaster to Libya's conflict and inadequate dam maintenance. They emphasize that up to 50% more rain hit eastern Libya due to global warming caused by human activity. Following the protests, a minister in eastern Libya's government announced that all journalists had been instructed to leave Derna, accusing them of obstructing the work of rescue teams. Analysts suggest institutional support for the protests, noting the unusual location of the demonstration at the Sahaba Mosque, typically restricted as part of the rescue area. The eastern government of Libya has mandated journalists to evacuate Derna in the wake of protests against the authorities, emerging 1 week after a catastrophic flood resulted in the loss of thousands of lives. Residents are demanding an impartial inquiry into the calamity, pushing for the reconstruction of the city under international oversight. These demands have garnered substantial media attention, with national TV channels opposing the authorities permitted to broadcast from Derna, an unusual development. Hichem Abouchkiouat, a minister in the eastern government, justified the directive for journalists to depart by asserting that a considerable number of reporters were impeding rescue operations. The media blackout coincided with reports of local police detaining and interrogating Libyan journalists over the weekend. Situated in northeastern Libya and under the control of military commander Khalifa Haftar, Derna functions under a government parallel to the internationally recognized administration in Tripoli. The crackdown on media activities follows the suspension of Derna's mayor, Abdul Manam al-Gaithi, as announced by Chikiouat. Protesters vehemently demanded the resignation of the head of the eastern-based Libyan parliament, Aguila Saleh. The prime minister dismissed all members of Derna's municipal council. The unrest underscores the profound political divisions in Libya, with many expressing dissatisfaction with the government's response to the crisis. The disaster unfolded despite multiple flood warnings, including an academic paper from last year underscoring the city's vulnerability. Derna continues to grapple with the aftermath as families search for bodies in the ruined city. Officials acknowledge the incomplete repair of dams post-2007, citing security concerns. Libya, functioning as a failed state for over a decade, has witnessed no nationwide authority since the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. The Libyan National Army, predominant in the east, assumed control of Derna in 2019, succeeding years of occupation by militant groups, including local branches of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Despite widespread calls for accountability in the aftermath of the devastating flood in Derna, observers have little optimism that the military-backed government will take substantial actions beyond consolidating its own power. Residents of the ravaged city have taken to the streets, expressing their frustration and demanding accountability for what they perceive as an inadequate response from regional authorities to a flood that claimed thousands of lives on September 11. Tarek Megerisi, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, highlighted the anger directed toward the Eastern Parliament, stating that it took them 4 days to convene, and when they did, the speaker criticized Libyans for questioning politicians and attributing blame for the disaster. Last week, Saleh characterized the flood as an act of God, pardoning politicians of responsibility. However, credible reports had previously indicated the lack of maintenance of the dams over the years. In 2022, civil engineering professor Abdul Waniz Ashur warned of disastrous consequences in the event of a major flood, emphasizing the vulnerability of residents in the valley and the city. Now, Libya's Eastern Administration's prosecutor has initiated an investigation and suspended Derna's mayor, Abdul Monem al-Gaithi. However, observers are skeptical of the significance of these actions, given the administration's reputation for nepotism. The decision to have a new fund for Derna's reconstruction handled by individuals associated with controversial figures, raises concerns, especially considering the suspicious handling of a previous reconstruction fund. Amnesty International has accused forces under Saddam Haftar, involved in the new fund, of committing atrocities against Libyan civilians since 2016. Sami Hamdi, managing director of the International Interest, shares the sentiment that there is little indication of accountability, citing the lack of trust in public institutions. This distrust may have contributed to an act of self-justice when demonstrators reportedly set the mayor's house on fire. The situation reflects a long-standing pattern of individual agendas superseding collective welfare, as noted by Ghassan Salami, the former head of the UN support mission in Libya. Transparency International's 2022 Corruption Perceptions Index ranked Libya 171 out of 180 countries, underscoring ongoing challenges related to corruption. It appears that things are not only just getting out of hand, they have already gotten out. Given that the military has backed it, how the government handles the situation is to be seen. If the situation exacerbates further, chances are that the military will be deployed to the streets, leading to public-military confrontation and perhaps a civil war. What do you think? Could killings be controlled if the Libyan government had taken the necessary steps? Or were the storm and cyclone too deadly to be managed? Let us know your thoughts on whether you think the situation in Libya can lead to the worst ever fight between people and government and a possible coup. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.